In the week after the Canadian Grand Prix, there were more celebrations in Canada as the International Olympic Committee awarded the 1988 Winter Olympics to Calgary, in preference to bids from Falun in Sweden and Cortina d'Ampezzo in Italy. It was Calgary's fourth application to host and Canada's seventh, but the first time they'd been successful. There were unusually only two candidates for the Summer Games, Nagoya in Japan, considered the favourite, and the South Korean capital of Seoul. Despite the latter never having hosted anything more complex than the 1980 Miss Universe event, it was selected by a decisive vote of 52 to 27. In Sweden, Nordisk Mobiltelefon set up the first cellular telephone system. Motorola in the US had demonstrated the first handheld cellular mobile phone in 1973, but it was hardly practical, weighing some 2 kilos, 4.4 pounds. NMT had been able to partner with Millicom to produce the first truly portable phone, though this was still very much a relative term, but made the specifications of their 450 MHz analog network public so that other companies could also develop hardware. In November, the network would spread to Norway, in January to Denmark, and in March to Finland, and NMT thus also became the first company to introduce international roaming tariffs. The hunger strike at the Maze prison in Northern Ireland, which had begun in March, was finally called off. 10 prisoners had died during the protest, with 6 more either removed for medical grounds or having been taken off the strike by their family. 3 days after the strike ended, the new Northern Ireland Secretary James Pryor, who had privately said he admired the courage of the strikers even if he disagreed with their aims, agreed to meet some of their original demands, including the right not to wear prison uniforms. President Anwar Sadat of Egypt was taking the salute at the annual 6th of October parade held to celebrate victory over Israel in the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when one of the trucks pulled over in front of the tribune and several soldiers dismounted. Sadat saluted them, and they opened fire before throwing grenades into the stand. Sadat and 10 others were killed or fatally wounded, including an Omani general, a Chinese aerospace engineer, and the Cuban ambassador. The leader of the assassins, Lieutenant Khalid al-Islambuli, stated that his motivation was that Sadat had made peace with Israel in 1979 at Camp David, while the civilian leader of the Cairo cell of the Tanzim al-Jihad group, Mohammed Faraj, was also arrested, having been missed in Sadat's purge in September. Sadat's funeral took place 2 days later and was attended by a huge number of international grandees given the short notice. 3 former US presidents, Carter, Ford and Nixon, as well as Menachem Begin, who walked throughout as the funeral was held on the Sabbath. But only 3 of the 24 members of the Arab League sent any representation at all, and the Sudanese president was the only Arab head of state present. Sadat was buried in the Unknown Soldier Mausoleum in Cairo and was succeeded by his vice president, Hosni Mubarak. The election for the FIA board had taken place between races too, with Prince Paul von Metternich re-elected as president of the FIA, with Jean-Marie Balestre now named as his deputy. But Balestre had faced a challenge to his presidency of the subcommittee FISA. He had been re-elected too, defeating Basil Tai by 33 to 17, and the RAC man was then reprimanded for the RAC's breaking ranks over the Lotus 88 at Silverstone and removed from his position as FISA's vice president. The United States Grand Prix had a history going back to 1908, but the difficulties of transporting cars across the Atlantic meant that American and European motorsport developed mostly independently of each other, although the Indy 500 did make efforts to attract international entries by adopting Grand Prix rules for periods and was still considered one of the great races. In 1957, Riverside Raceway opened in California, and the following year ran a US Grand Prix to USAC road race rules. A Russian-born entrepreneur, Alec Ullman, had redeveloped an abandoned wartime Florida airfield, Sebring, to host endurance racing, and in 1959 he invited Formula One to the second US Grand Prix, and it was selected as the last of the 9 championship races that year, Bruce McLaren winning his first race there. But Sebring was isolated and difficult to get to, and then the prize money checks bounced, so for 1960 the race was back at Riverside, but despite a great performance from Sterling Moss to win from pole, it was another financial disaster. With Ullman running out of options, the mantle of the US Grand Prix passed to another promoter, Cameron R. Jetzinger, who owned a circuit in upstate New York. The village of Watkins Glen had held races on public roads for many years, but after a horrific fatal accident, a new purpose-built circuit was constructed in the surrounding wooded hills. The US Grand Prix moved to Watkins Glen in 1961 and remained there for nearly 2 decades. But as speeds increased and the circuit fell behind in upgrading its facilities, drivers became more and more concerned about the track's safety. Several high-profile fatalities, including the gruesome deaths of François Savert in 1973 and Helmut Koenig in 1975, meant that the circuit could no longer avoid safety upgrades, but neither could they afford them, while also paying the appearance fees and prize money in their contracts. And after the 1980 race won by Alan Jones, the US government declined to keep covering their debt, and that was that. Meanwhile, a British former travel agent, Chris Pook, had persuaded the city authorities of Long Beach, California to hold a road race, which began as a Formula 5000 event in 1975, then became the US Grand Prix West from 1976 onwards. While it had never quite succeeded in becoming Monaco on the Pacific, it had been broadly successful financially and gained a lot of coverage as the season opener, and had seen some great races. Bernie Ecclestone believed that the US represented a huge and mostly untapped market for Formula One and had been trying for years to get a third race on the calendar, and saw street circuits as the way forward. In 1980 he'd tried to get a race through the streets of Las Vegas and along the Strip off the ground, but it had foundered in the face of official opposition from ACUS, the US motorsport governing body. But with the failure of Watkins Glen, ACUS was persuaded to sanction a race in Vegas, with Billy Weinberger, CEO of the Caesars Palace Hotel and Casino, offering their vast parking lot as a venue in exchange for naming rights of the race itself. Weinberger didn't even pretend to an interest in F1, and was very clear that the race for him was purely a commercial opportunity. He would later say that the objective for him was to bring 10 new high rollers to his casino. Chris Pook was drafted in to make it all work, and a winding anti-clockwise circuit was quickly laid out in the car park, with temporary concrete barriers keeping the cars on track. The usual requirement for a test event was waved away, though the final round of the Can-Am series was held on the track a week or so before the main event. Paul Newman was appointed race director, and all was ready. The hotel certainly pushed the boat out in terms of promoting the event and trying to give it a sheen of glitz and razzmatazz, but the drivers were mostly unimpressed. The tight turns, often taken blind thanks to the high concrete barriers, and anti-clockwise layout made it physically demanding, especially in what could still be pretty hot weather in October, and they just didn't find it particularly interesting to drive on. Alan Jones, definitely not a fan of what would be his last Grand Prix venue, called it a flattened-out goat track. They did at least find that the surface was lovely and smooth, and that there were quite a few places to overtake. At any rate, here they were, and there was a championship to decide. 3 drivers went into the race with the chance of taking the big prize. Carlos Reutemann led the championship by 1 point over Nelson Piquet, but had just 5 points from the last 5 races. Hadn't won since Belgium in May, and relations with the Williams team were frosty at best. Piquet had had 4 podiums in the last 5 races, had the full backing of the Brabham team, and seemed to have all the momentum. With 3 wins to Reutemann's 2, he just needed to score 1 more point to take the title on a tiebreak. The wild card in the pack was Jacques Laffite, winner at Austria and Canada, 5 points behind Reutemann, so he absolutely had to either win or come second, and hope the other 2 weren't right behind him. Perhaps to distract the media from all the talk of Laffite's championship chances, as Jacques feigned indifference by getting in some golf, his boss Guy Ligier made a surprise announcement by saying that Eddie Cheever would be Laffite's teammate in 1982. Eddie had been widely expected to sign for Arrows, and Ligier had never hired a non-francophone driver before. Evidently unsatisfied with Patrick Tombay's work in the second car, he told Auto Hebdo, "There are no more French drivers, the talent pool is exhausted. Ferté and Alliot aren't ready for F1. Ligier was adamant that it wasn't a financial choice, though Cheever was known to be friendly with famous F1 patrons Mansur Ojeh and Count Zanon. Mario Andretti had yet to officially confirm he would be leaving Alfa Romeo and Formula One at the end of the year, but it was widely expected. He'd driven 7 IndyCar races for Patrick Racing during the season, with 2 second places and 2 thirds, as well as second in the Indy 500. He had been awarded the win after Bobby Unser was penalised, but had recently heard that the penalty had been rescinded under appeal, so second place it was. Nonetheless, he generally had a better time of it in IndyCar than in Formula One, and most people expected that he would commit to the full season with Patrick Racing for 1982. If so, his final season in F1 had been a bit of a damp squib, and with the improving Alfa Romeo 179D, he would be keen to go out on a high note on home soil. Bernie Ecclestone had likewise confirmed the signing of Riccardo Patrese, despite wild rumours that he'd offered huge sums to both James Hunt and Jackie Stewart, though other rumours suggested that those rumours had been put about by Bernie himself as a PR stunt for the big season finale. Williams and Piquet's Brabham had water cooling systems on their rear brakes, the Ferrari had a new rear wing, and Mansell's Lotus had been modified with a longer wheelbase and wider rear track. And Teddy Yip's little team, struggling for sponsorship all season despite some pretty reasonable results, had brokered a one-race deal with Valvoline. The tyre manufacturers, with no data to work from, had largely opted to provide hard tyres, Pirelli offering 2 different compounds of qualifiers, while Avon had super sticky Q tyres which would only last a single flying lap. With the race scheduled for Saturday, a familiarisation session was held on Wednesday, then the first time session on Thursday, and to everyone's surprise, Carlos Reutemann topped the sheets. Whatever problems he was having with his team seemed only to motivate him in the cockpit, and with Jones second in the timings, it looked like the Williams suited the circuit. Piquet was 5th behind Prost and Villeneuve, and Laffite 10th, just 0.004 seconds slower than teammate Patrick Tambay, whose 1982 prospects could hang on his performance here. The slightly built Nelson Piquet was suffering from the anti-clockwise track and the so-called Vegas neck more than most, and he hired Sugar Ray Leonard's masseur to give him a rub down after Thursday's session, but the boxing man was used to working on rather burlier figures, and mostly what Nelson got out of the experience was a lot of bruising and even more pain. He missed Friday morning's practice, having some more gentle arm massages so he'd be ready for qualifying, but nobody could touch Reutemann at the front, though Alan Jones even tried with his engine cover off to see if that improved airflow to his rear wing. The Aussie's efforts saw him the only other driver to break into the 1-minute 17s, and he would line up alongside his teammate on the front row. Gilles Villeneuve put in another great drive to line up third, with Piquet improving 1 place to be 4th and hoping to get a good start and wriggle between the Williamses. Prost and Watson shared row 3, then Tambay a terrific 7th alongside Giacomelli, benefiting from the improvements to handling that Gerard Larousse had effected. Mansell was 9th in the extended wheelbase Lotus, then Andretti, Patrese 11th in his last race for Arrows, and only then in 12th place the third title challenger in the shape of Jacques Laffite, who just couldn't get his car set up right, and it looked rather like it was going to be between the 2 South Americans. Arnoux was back in 13th after an engine fire and an accident, lining up alongside De Cesaris, whose only incident so far had been a valve falling out of his engine. De Angelis was back in 15th with suspension problems, Rebacke went off and was 16th. Those super sticky Avons propelled Alboreto to 17th, 2 places ahead of the Goodyear-shod Chiva, the 2 Tyrrells bracketing a deeply unhappy Didier Pironi, who just couldn't get his car handling right and had blown a turbo to boot. Keke Rosberg put in a superhuman effort despite a sticking steering rack to put a Fittipaldi on the grid for the first time since Silverstone, and Derek Warwick also improved by over a second over Thursday to qualify for his first Grand Prix. Sura and Salazar made up the last row, relegating Slim Borgard and Derek Daly from a relatively safe 20th and 21st on Thursday. They would join Chico Serra, Jacques Villeneuve, Brian Henton and Beppe Gabbiani in sitting it out, the second Azella driver well and truly ignored by the team and not even setting a time on Friday. The razzmatazz continued on race day as there were performances by Tom Jones, who did a lap of the circuit in a chariot, Wayne Newton and Sammy Davis Jr., before the race flags were delivered by Skydiving Team. I wish I could find any pictures of any of this, but the drivers were trying to concentrate. Reutemann looked focused and was all smiles on the surface, getting his race engineer Neil Oatley to check over his suspension. Piquet looked relaxed and happy, but still working his shoulder trying to ease the muscle pains. Jones, asked if he would be riding shotgun for his teammate to help him win the title, replied that he didn't see how he could do that without blocking other cars and, as I'm a member of the British Commonwealth, I would consider that unsporting. The drivers were delivered a talking to from Paul Newman, who stressed that they were going to be particularly strict about start procedures and would be coming down very hard on drivers who tried to gain an advantage by lining up left or right of their designated grid position. It was hot, the track was dusty, and it was going to be a gruelling race for all of them as they lined up on the track for the start, Villeneuve pointing his Ferrari at the gap between the Williamses. Away they went, and indeed the Ferrari leaped off the line. Jones held the lead, but Villeneuve went into turn 1 second, while Reutemann was slow away and dropped behind Prost too, and Jarier broke his transmission right off the line and was pushed away. So at the end of lap 1, Jones led Villeneuve, who was holding off Prost, while Giacomelli had also got past Reutemann, who was now trying to hold off a flu-ridden Watson. While Piquet dropped back to 8th behind Laffite in 7th, the Ligier driver got a cracking start and gained 5 places. As Jones extended his lead, a three-way battle was developing between Villeneuve, Prost and Giacomelli, while Watson got ahead of Reutemann into fifth off-camera towards the end of lap 2, and Reutemann's gearbox had just lost fourth gear. Prost made his way past Villeneuve to take second at the start of lap 3, while Laffite continued to charge, now taking sixth off Reutemann as he chased the first or second place he needed to take the title. Meanwhile, De Angelis came in wanting new tyres, feeling something was off with his current set, but the Lotus mechanics found a coolant leak, and that was that. As Prost cleared off in pursuit of Jones, Giacomelli started looking for a way past the Ferrari in his turn. Tombe, scrapping in the midfield, had made contact with De Cesaris sufficiently to affect his steering, and at turn 13 it wouldn't turn, and he went head-on into a tyre wall, tearing off the nose of his car to such an extent that he could just stand up and walk out of the car, or rather hop as he'd hurt his left leg in the process, but he could count himself very lucky. He was sent off to the medical centre but had just suffered some bruising. What the accident would do to his prospects of future employment, of course, was another matter. His teammate Laffite was still motoring, now overtaking Watson for fifth, and was closing in on the Giacomelli-Villeneuve battle, and with both Reutemann and Piquet out of the points in 7th and 8th places, it suddenly looked like a Laffite title might be on after all. By lap 7 there were two distinct groups behind Jones and Prost, the Williams leading the Renault by about 6 seconds, Villeneuve, Giacomelli, Laffite and Watson in 3rd through 6th places, then Reutemann, Piquet and Andretti behind. Reutemann struggling without 4th gear but still managing to keep Piquet behind him, which was all that counted, unless Laffite managed to make his way into the top 2. Just like Alan Jones, home favourite Mario Andretti was driving what was likely to be his last race and was also keen to do well. The teammates of Prost and Villeneuve, meanwhile, were having a dreadful time. Arnoux pulled in to retire on lap 11 with a faulty spark plug, putting an end to a pretty awful season, at which point Pironi was running 13th between Rebecca and Alboreto. As Villeneuve continued holding up Giacomelli, those two groups had merged into one long train, with just 4.5 seconds covering 3rd through 9th places, as unbeknownst to everyone, including Gilles himself, the race organisers had decided to disqualify him for lining up out of his grid slot, and it was turning into a major argument in race control as the entire machinery of the Ferrari team swung into action to stop the black flag going out. Not knowing any of this, of course, Giacomelli was giving it the good college try, but the Alfa V12 just didn't quite have the power of the Ferrari turbo ahead of it, and it could never quite get close enough. Reutemann and Piquet were also still battling, with Nelson needing to get past if he wanted to stand any chance of the title, but Reutemann knew that too, and was doing everything he could to stay ahead. After the race, Piquet said that he thought Reutemann had been trying to get him to run into the back of the Williams, which would take them both out and secure Carlos the title. Jones lapped the first of the backmarkers, Sura, as he came round to finish lap 15, just as Pironi pitted for new tyres. It turned out these stickier Michelin tyres were picking up all the dust and marbles, which really wasn't helping their performance at all. Didier left the pits back in 18th. Just then Reutemann braked a little early into the last corner, and Piquet shot down the inside to take 7th place. Now it was just a matter of him getting ahead of the car in front of him, John Watson, or waiting until someone ahead dropped out. Andretti, meanwhile, had also come past Reutemann, who was beginning to drop back behind the group as he continued wrestling with his gearbox. Another second driver having a pretty torrid season, Hector Rebecca, pulled over with a stuck throttle on lap 21, as Jones continued to extend his lead from Prost, now 13.4 seconds, with the Villeneuve train now 22 seconds behind the Renault. But off-camera, as the director concentrated on the Ferrari, Piquet had got past Watson for 6th place, which meant that as things stood, Nelson would be champion. But it was still not quite 1/3 distance, so there was a lot of race left to run. Laffite could certainly see that the red and white McLaren in his mirrors had been replaced by a blue and white Brabham, and he renewed his efforts to take 4th off Giacomelli, and succeeded going into turn 1 at the start of lap 23, just as the director cut away to a shot of Derek Warwick, circulating in 15th in his first Grand Prix. And then suddenly Villeneuve was climbing out of a stationary Ferrari, his ignition having failed him, which promoted Laffite now to 3rd, just one place off where he needed to be. Villeneuve's retirement meant Piquet had advanced to 5th, but while all that was going on, Andretti had got past him too, relegating him back into 6th place. Still good enough as things stood, but if Laffite managed to get past Prost into 2nd, Piquet would need to score more than a single point. And he certainly wasn't going to win the title if he got taken off, as Giacomelli made a heroic effort to keep Andretti behind him, while Piquet tried in turn to claw back a place from whichever Alfa ended up in front. The battle was resolved when Giacomelli put a wheel in the wrong place and spun, but kept the engine running and got moving again with some help from the marshals, rejoining 10th, while fellow Marlboro man de Cesaris spent several minutes in the pits with a gearbox problem and rejoined 18th. So with Giacomelli gone, Piquet moved up a place into 5th again, with Watson 6th and Reutemann 7th, but then Watty pulled in for new boots on lap 28, putting Reutemann up into 6th. So Piquet and Reutemann were now equal on points, with Laffite 3 behind the pair of them. And then Andretti clouted a wall, and with his right rear wheel canted up at an alarming angle, he couldn't do much other than retire. So Piquet and Reutemann both advanced another place, but rather than bearing down on Piquet, the number 2 Williams had a mirror full of Lotus, as Nigel Mansell, having made steady progress through the field, was now looking for a way past. So on lap 31, Jones led Prost by 21 seconds, Laffite was another 20 seconds behind, then Piquet 7 seconds behind the Ligier, Reutemann and Mansell 5th and 6th, then Giacomelli, Patrese, Alboreto and Watson. Prost came in on lap 33, also suffering from dirty Michelins, which moved Laffite up into 2nd and Piquet to 3rd. Second place was only good enough for Jacques if Reutemann didn't score and Piquet only scored 1 point, and right now they were on 3 and 4 respectively. No, 2 and 4 in fact, because Mansell passed Reutemann for 4th in all the excitement. Prost meanwhile had rejoined 6th and set about getting back up the order on his fresh tyres, passing Reutemann easily on lap 35, making it 52 points for Piquet, 50 for Reutemann and 49 for Laffite as things stood. Prost passed Mansell and lapped Pironi in short order, and Laffite was starting to also suffer from dirty Michelins, and Piquet was closing in, with Prost gaining on him in turn. Soon enough, Prost was right on Piquet's tail, and with no reason to make it difficult for him, Nelson moved over and let him go. In fact, if Alain got past his compatriot Laffite, that would actually help Piquet's cause. That was lap 43, and Prost headed off in pursuit of the Ligier, whose driver was still reluctant to give up track position by stopping for tyres and was losing ground to Prost all the time. Meanwhile, Giacomelli was charging hard after his accident and had arrived on Reutemann's rear, then got past into 6th and the points on lap 45, just as Prost caught Laffite and, to the surprise of the cameraman, passed him at the start of lap 46. Piquet 51, Reutemann 49, Laffite 47. Prost left Laffite in the dust and set off to see if he could do anything about Jones, or at least be well placed to benefit from any problem with the Williams, while Pironi pulled into the Ferrari pit for 4 new tyres and a left skirt. Leaving the pit 12th of the 14 still running, he promptly set the fastest lap of the race. Laffite, meanwhile, had dropped back into the clutches of Piquet, who went past just as Jones lapped Reutemann. Laffite was now finding Mansell bearing down on him. Piquet 52, Reutemann 49, Laffite 46. When Mansell shot past the Ligier in turn and began to gain on Piquet, Laffite decided that he really did need to change tyres, and did so, rejoining 8th. While all the cameras watched Jones, Mansell got past Piquet into 3rd, and Laffite's stop had promoted Reutemann back into the points. He was now 6th, but it still wouldn't be enough. Piquet 51, Reutemann 50, Laffite 43. With just over 20 laps to go, Piquet was suffering physically and having to take it a bit easy, and soon Giacomelli pulled up behind the Brabham and again got past without much of a fight. Piquet 50, Reutemann 50, Laffite 43. While the BBC was off doing a news update and NBC was doing an inane "Ooh, isn't F1 all international" item, Giacomelli got past Mansell too. The Englishman's leg was cramping in a badly fitted seat, putting the Alfa up into 3rd, but as long as Piquet could hold on to that 5th place, none of it mattered for the championship with 15 laps to go. It certainly didn't look good for Reutemann, who lost 6th to Watson, but Piquet was visibly flagging, and it was by no means certain he'd actually be able to physically make it to the end of the race. His driving was becoming jerky, and Watson was starting to make inroads into the 23-second gap between them. With 10 laps to go, Piquet had noticeably slowed, enough for Eliseo Salazar to unlap himself in the ensign, while Laffite on his fresh tyres passed Reutemann and was right behind Watson as they both chased down Piquet. The gap was down to 12 seconds with 5 laps to go. By the penultimate lap, as Piquet's head lolled from side to side in the cockpit, Watson and Laffite in formation were just 8 seconds behind the Brabham, and if both of them passed him, the title would go to Reutemann. Meanwhile, Giacomelli had been closing on Prost and went into the last lap right behind him. Jones took a seamless lights-to-flag victory to sign off his Formula One career with a win. Prost held Giacomelli off for just long enough to take second place. but Bruno would be happy with his first podium, and the first for Alfa Romeo since 1951, with Mansell fourth, but crossing the line in fifth to be crowned 1981 world champion was a visibly shattered Nelson Piquet, with Laffite taking sixth off Watson on the last lap for the last point, which secured him fourth in the title race ahead of Prost. Reutemann finished eighth in the end, a lap adrift of Jones, with Pironi ninth, with at least the fastest lap as consolation for a pretty rotten season, and Rosberg keeping the Fittipaldi running to a commendable 10th, with Patrese and De Cesaris 11th and 12th after both stopping for long repairs, Alboreto 13th with a late engine failure, and Salazar still running but 14 laps down and unclassified after having an early 10-minute stop. Jones, looking fresh as the proverbial daisy, climbed out of his Williams and headed for the podium clutching a can of beer, joined by Prost and Giacomelli. The organisers wanted to take Piquet to the podium too, but Nelson was still in his cockpit, suffering from heat exhaustion, having thrown up in his helmet, and was being tended to by the medics. So, with the camera still watching that, Advance Australia Fair sounded over the podium one last time as the 1981 season drew to a close. A new world champion, won in just his third full season of F1 racing, and Brabham's first driver's title since Sir Jack sold up 10 years earlier. And Reutemann? Almost forgotten by the media as they rushed to congratulate Brazil's second world champion, he was quietly devastated. He said his suspension was too stiff and he'd been having gearbox problems, then slipped away. But then Patrick Head begged to differ and said there was nothing wrong with the car and everything wrong with its driver. And just for good measure, the organisers retrospectively disqualified Villeneuve. Now it didn't really matter one way or the other. After all the muttering and grumbling, the odd track had actually provided a pretty good race, with plenty of overtaking and a fair dollop of drama. Whether it would be a one-off or back next year was still unknown, as was much about the 1982 season. Who would be driving for Constructors' Champions Williams? After a much better end to the season and a decent financial offer, Jones was rumoured to be reconsidering after all, while Reutemann would undoubtedly leave if Allen stayed, and maybe even if he didn't. One source I read said that he announced his retirement a few days after the race, but I haven't found anything about that anywhere else, but it was certainly on his mind. It was even unknown what the rules would be. A meeting of various designers had convened in Vegas before the race to try and hammer out new rules for 1982 that would avoid all of the palaver over hydrodynamic suspensions and the definition of flexible in terms of skirt materials, but it had broken up without a decision. But that's for the future, or indeed the past. This has been a remake of my first series on the 1981 season, which was originally made in February 2021 onwards. The 1982 season is therefore already available to watch, as is every other season up to and including 1995. There's one more 1981 video to go, a team-by-team season review, and then I'll be off on my holidays. So while I'm enjoying the Rhineland, you get a 2-week excursion to 1932 and a very different atmosphere in Germany, and then in the third week in August your scheduled programming returns with the season preview for 1996.